When the alarms failed and the stars themselves began to blink out, humanity didn't scream. We stared into the dark and whispered, "Not yet." They called us fragile, primitive, the last embers of a dying species clinging to a cold world. But they never understood humans don't yield. We adapt. We burn brighter because the night is darker. She arrived on a Tuesday. No ships, no sound, just a shimmer in the air and a voice like starlight saying, "You are not supposed to survive this long." Her name was Lyra, or that's what she let me call her. She said she came to observe us, to study the final phase of extinction. But that night, when the sky cracked open and the first of the harvesters descended, she did something her kind were forbidden to do. She chose to save me. And as her trembling hands reached for mine, she whispered one word: instinct. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't love. It was something far older. Something she didn't understand, but we did. Because somewhere deep in our bones, buried under fear and fire, that same instinct had carried us through every dark age before. That night, humanity didn't just survive. We changed, and the universe would never look at us the same way again. Tell me, when the stars go dark, what will your instinct be?
Before that night, my life was painfully ordinary. A flickering apartment light, the low hum of an aging purifier, coffee that always tasted faintly of metal because the filters hadn't been replaced since the blackout rationing began. I was just another engineer in what was left of Houston, if you could still call it that. Half the skyline was gone. The other half was fenced behind energy barriers powered by reactors no one truly understood anymore. We'd stopped calling it a city years ago. Now, it was simply Sector 12A. Still, we tried. Every morning, people lined up for rations, smiled at strangers, traded stories about how the crops were coming in on the orbital farms. We pretended it was normal, because pretending was the only thing holding us together. I used to tell myself I fixed machines, not people, but that was a lie. Every cable I soldered, every reactor core I coaxed back to life, it was a quiet prayer that someone out there still believed in tomorrow. We'd lost the stars, sure. The cosmic storms had erased half the constellations, but we still had each other. And that, somehow, felt enough. Until she arrived. Lyra didn't come from any port, shuttle, or gate. One moment the scanner bay was empty, the next she stood there, shimmering like heat above asphalt. No ID chip, no records, just eyes the color of dying nebula, and a voice that made the air vibrate. "You are not supposed to see me," she said softly. And for the first time in years, I felt afraid. Not the kind of fear that makes you run, the kind that makes you remember. We'd heard rumors before about observers. Silent travelers who drifted between systems, recording the last days of dying civilizations. No one had ever seen one. No one ever lived long enough to tell. But she was standing in front of me, flesh and light, studying me like I was an echo from a forgotten age. "Are you human?" I asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Her gaze flickered. "That depends on what you mean by human." She stayed after that. No one stopped her. No one even noticed her, except me. It was like the world's sensors couldn't decide she existed. She'd watch me repair circuits, trace her fingers over cracked reactor shells, whisper equations that solved problems our computers couldn't even compute. Once, I caught her standing in the rain, palms raised, eyes closed, as if she was listening to something beneath the thunder. "What do you hear?" I asked. "The pulse of a dying world," she said quietly. Then she looked at me and added, "And yet, it refuses to stop beating." That was Lyra. Always distant, always calm. But sometimes I caught her staring at people, at couples laughing, at children running through the rain with something I couldn't name. Longing, maybe.
or regret. It was 2 weeks before she told me the truth. Her kind, the Veyron Collective, had been watching us for centuries. Not guiding, not helping, just waiting. Because according to their data, humanity should have extinguished themselves generations ago. War, climate collapse, isolation. Every simulation predicted our end. Yet, here we are, scarred, broken, still alive. Your persistence, she said one night, is statistically impossible. Yeah, so is the fire, until we made it. She smiled then, small, almost human. That was the night she began asking questions, dangerous ones. Why do humans dream? Why do we fight for things we can't keep? Why do we risk everything for someone else's heartbeat? I didn't have answers. I just told her the truth. Because that's what humans do. We feel first and figure out the math later. And maybe that's why she started to change. Her eyes softened. Her voice trembled when she spoke, like she was discovering something her own species had forgotten. But the universe doesn't forgive curiosity. The first warning came 3 nights later, a deep vibration that rattled the reactor walls and made the lights flicker like dying fireflies. Lyra froze, her entire form pulsing with color. "They found me," she whispered. "Who?" I asked. Her gaze turned distant, voice trembling. "The ones who erase what should not exist, and the humans who get too close." Outside, the night sky rippled like water, and the stars began to vanish, one by one. She said she came to observe us, but the way she looked at me then, I think she'd finally decided to choose us. If you're still with me, hit subscribe, because what's coming next will test the very soul of humanity.
The first harvesters came like a fault in the sky. At first, they were thin lines, ribbons of light drifting between the stars. Then they bled into shapes that refused to be called ships. They were angles and teeth and glass hard as memory, moving with a logic that looked nothing like life. We saw them over Sector 12A first, as a ripple that made the streetlights shiver. Then the ground itself answered with a sound like 1,000 distant bells cracking. Homes trembled. Glass rained. People stumbled into the streets and looked up, faces pale, mouths open, waiting for an explanation the sky could not give. They didn't speak. They didn't hail. The harvesters exhaled a light cold, surgical, and entire blocks fell silent, as if a hand had pressed against the city's throat. Power grids died in elegant, patterned waves. Life support hiccuped. Comms collapsed into static that tasted like ash. We fought at the edges. Volunteers with jury-rigged rifles and kitchen knives. Engineers in oily overalls trying to restart reactors with wet hands. Old women who had survived worse than hunger, holding up children and singing until the sound of their voices drowned the alarm sirens. They took what they needed first. Food stores, water processors, the orbital farm beacons, and left things worse. The quiet in the wake of efficient theft, the slow, calculated removal of anything that could feed a future. Machines that harvested crops without remorse were nothing compared to the way they left us looking at empty shelves, at ration cards that now meant nothing. I can still hear the moment rage replaced fear. It started with a small man in the ration line who refused to step aside when an automated scavenger tipped a crate of grain into its maw. The scavenger's arm swept him away as if he were a worm. The line went still, and then someone screamed, not for themselves, for the loss of another human dignity. That scream landed like lightning. Anger makes people brave. Anger makes them stupid. We learned both lessons in the same breath. We burned what we could not carry. We welded scrap into spikes. We bundled MRI magnets with old capacitors and hoped that science remembered our names. We learned the harvesters weren't invulnerable. They moved with a pattern, a timing, a rhythm if you could read it. Lyra learned it faster than any of us.
She watched them with the blank quiet of a scholar who had stumbled into the wrong chapter. "They are precise," she said, voice small. "They carve to minimize entropy." "Then cut their rhythm," I told her. "Make them stumble." Her eyes, nebula blue, lit with something that looked alarmingly like hope. She showed us a weakness: resonance. A reactor spike, focused and synchronized, could create a field that confused the harvester's sensors for a breath. It was not a weapon. It was a lullaby for machines, an interference that pretended to be the noise of a dead world. We worked like people who had nothing left to lose. The old reactor that fed Sector 12A was a relic. We pushed it, rewired control loops until the software screamed and the metal wept. Children handed spanners to men with bleeding hands. We argued about who would take the risk in whispers that sounded like prayers. The first attempt saved a block. It threw a harvester off its course and it crashed into the river with the sound of tearing cotton. People in the street cheered like it was a sun rising. For a day, for a thin, shimmering day, we believed we could push back. Then the skies answered. They arrived in numbers stacked like winter mountains, towering columns black and silver and humming with the kind of power that rewrites equations on the fly. The harvesters we'd seen were scouts. Scouts became herds. Herds became an engine. The new ships didn't just take resources. They targeted symbols, reactor hubs, water towers, the places where people gathered to be human. We lost friends. The medic who gave his place to a child. The translator who taught Lyra our swear words and laughed when she mispronounced each one. Little victories turned to dust when the enemy learned to adapt. The resonance field worked for minutes, then seconds. The harvesters adjusted their timing, their sensors learning the pattern as children learn a lullaby. It felt like watching a puzzle solve itself with our blood as pieces. There were moments that split us open. Once, as we pulled survivors from a collapsed shelter, Lyra put her hand on a boy's chest and closed her eyes. Tears, real human tears, traced her cheeks. I did not know grief could sear like this. I did not know you would still sing when everything else burned. Her presence became a wildfire. Some wanted to put it out. Rumors swelled that Lyra was not just an observer. She had choices. She had betrayed her own. We saw the white glows of the harvester scouts move like searching eyes. We watched them zoom past Lyra once and look back as if making a note. That is when the decision hardened. We could not wait for salvation. The world's defenders, of what remained of national fleets, sent one message before their towers went dark: do not engage alone. But we were already engaged. Alone was the new normal. Alone became us. We organized into something the invaders could not immediately quantify: irregulars, not soldiers, not heroes, people who remembered that making noise sometimes confused the enemy, and that a human mind is an instrument no machine can fully predict. We used art, music played through hacked transmitters to scramble sonar signatures. We hid in basements wired with scrap copper and old satellite dishes, broadcasting the sound of human laughter to throw off thermal sensors. It was ridiculous. It was brilliant. It was human. One night, during our worst week, we pulled off a small miracle. A harvester descended on our makeshift hospital. We fed it the resonance, 3 reactors timed like a heartbeat, and watched it pause, hesitate, then tilt as if confused. Soldiers in scavenged armor rushed it with plasma cutters and managed to collapse one of its legs. We cheered until the cheers broke into sobs. Then the sky opened again. A shadow eclipsed the wreckage we had celebrated. A mothership huge beyond the scale of the city, a living eclipse hung above the river. From its belly, the harvesters swarmed like bees answering a horn. They moved with a new intent. Precision turned to menace. Where we had been hopeful, the universe pressed cold fingers into our throats. Lyra stood beside me on the roof, and for the first time I saw an expression that wasn't curiosity or pity. It was guilt. It was fear. It was resolved. She took my hand, small and hot. They will catalog us. They will decide the worth of every child born and every bone left. If they deem us unworthy, her voice fractured. Then we'll make them wrong, I said, and I didn't know if I was promising her or promising myself. Below, an air siren started a long, human sound. It wasn't a warning this time. It was an answer. We had one plan left. It would cost us everything we had left to give. It would either be our end or the first line of a story the universe would not forget. Share this chapter with someone who believes people can change the outcome because the next move will decide everything.
The night before the end smelled like ozone and dust. Sector 12A was burned into a lattice of glass and bone. Only a handful of us remained in the reactor complex, the last heartbeat of a dying city. Lyra stood before the main console, her silver skin streaked with soot. The emergency lights painted her face in trembling red pulses. She didn't look alien anymore. She just looked human. "This won't work twice," I told her. "It doesn't have to be," she said. "Once is enough if it's perfect." We'd found a frequency buried deep in the old reactor's code, a resonance pattern hidden in the noise. Lyra called it the human signature. Chaotic, unpredictable, emotional. It wasn't designed to destroy. It was meant to broadcast. The plan was madness. Overload the main reactor, let it reach critical mass, and channel the explosion through Lyra's biofield. She could amplify it and turn it into a signal that would pulse across the planet and beyond. Not a weapon of destruction, a message, a scream into the dark that said, "We're still here." We didn't have ships, we didn't have armies. All we had was one reactor, one alien who believed in us, and one chance to make the universe notice. Outside, the mothership hung low, so low its shadow swallowed the horizon. Its underbelly pulsed with violet fire. I could see smaller craft spilling out like veins of light, descending toward us. Lyra turned to me. "Once I start, you must leave. Not a chance. You will die. Then I'll die doing something worth remembering." She looked at me then. Really looked. The way a person looks when they finally understand what love costs. "You humans," she whispered. "You fight even when there is no hope. That's the point. Hope isn't something we're given. It's something we make." When the first harvester broke through the barricade, we were ready. Old cannons, arc welders, railgun fragments all pointed at the door. They poured in like liquid metal, moving with inhuman precision. Every shot we fired felt like spitting at a storm. But still, we fired. The air turned to heat. Sparks filled the room like fireflies. A woman beside me screamed as a plasma bolt caught her shoulder, but she didn't fall back. She tore the weapon from her attacker's arm and jammed it into its chest. Rage, pain, defiance. For a few seconds, we were infinite. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. "The field is forming, 10%, 20%. Her body glowed brighter with each word, her hair lifted in invisible wind, her eyes burning like miniature stars. The harvesters hesitated and confused. The room hummed with a frequency I could feel in my bones. They sensed something they didn't understand, something alive. 40%, Lyra shouted. "You must hold." We held. God, we held. Every second stretched like eternity. The floor cracked. The air warped. A harvester grabbed me by the throat, and I saw my reflection in its faceless mask of humanity, small and stubborn. I slammed a spanner through its visor and felt its metal heart stop. Lyra screamed. The sound wasn't pain. It was evolution. Her body was glowing into spiraling patterns, fractal and wild. Her voice layered itself in harmonies that weren't human anymore. The harvesters began to falter, twitching as if something inside their code was unraveling. 80%!
Lyra shouted. "You must hold them." We held. God, we held. Every second stretched like eternity. The floor cracked. The air warped. A harvester grabbed me by the throat, and I saw my reflection in its faceless mask of humanity, small and stubborn. I slammed a spanner through its visor and felt its metal heart stop. Lyra screamed. The sound wasn't pain, it was evolution. Her body was glowing into spiraling patterns, fractal and wild. Her voice layered itself in harmonies that weren't human anymore. The harvesters began to falter, twitching as if something inside their code was unraveling. 80%! Lyra shouted. "You must hold them." We held. God, we held. Every second stretched like eternity. The floor cracked. The air warped. A harvester grabbed me by the throat, and I saw my reflection in its faceless mask of humanity, small and stubborn. I slammed a spanner through its visor and felt its metal heart stop. Lyra screamed. The sound wasn't pain, it was evolution. Her body glowed into spiraling patterns. Her voice layered itself into harmonies that weren't human anymore. The harvesters began to falter, twitching as if something inside their code was unraveling. 80%, Lyra shouted. "You must hold them." We held. God, we held. And then the mothership responded. It turned its cannons downward. "Lyra," I yelled, "they're charging." "I can stop them, but I can't survive the feedback." "Then don't stop them. Finish it." She smiled, tears cutting bright streaks through the ash on her cheeks. "Such impossible creatures," she whispered. The mothership fired. A beam of violet annihilation fell from the clouds, but it never reached the ground. Lyra caught it. Her arms outstretched, body arched backward as energy cascaded through her. The reactor exploded behind her in a storm of blue-white fire, feeding into her biofield. She screamed again, but this time it was a sound the universe could hear. A wave of light tore outward, brighter than sunrise, washing over everything. The harvesters froze mid-motion, their bodies liquefying into dust. The mothership shuddered, its structure unraveling into fractal smoke. For one impossible moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the world was on fire, but the sky was ours. No more shadows, no more ships, just the stars. Every single one of them, blazing brighter than I'd ever seen. Lyra lay in the center of the blast crater, her glow fading like a dying ember. I stumbled toward her, kneeling in the ash. Her lips moved. "Did it work?" I nodded, tears cutting through grime. "You did it. You saved us." She smiled weakly. "No, you did. I only remembered what you already knew." Her hand found mine. "Don't let them forget, Scott. Make them remember what it means to be human." And then the light in her eyes went out. The air was still humming, though, faint, rhythmic. I looked up and gasped. Across the sky, written in glowing trails of ionized air, was her final message. 4 words, repeating, over and over, stretching from horizon to horizon. "We are still here." People from every sector crawled out of the ruins to see it. Some fell to their knees. Some screamed. Most just cried. Because for the first time in centuries, the universe had heard us. And somewhere beyond those stars, something was listening. Days later, deep space arrays picked up a signal. It wasn't alien. It wasn't human. It was an answer. A voice, faint, trembling, almost human, whispered through the static. "Acknowledged. Transmission received. Preparing contact protocol." And the signal carried her name, Lyra. If that moment gave you chills, hit like, and share this story so the next time the dark listens, it hears the voice of humanity.
The world that woke after the light wave was not the one that had burned. We were fewer than half of humanity gone, maybe more, but for the first time in centuries, the air felt alive. The static in the sky had cleared. The reactors hummed with steady rhythms again, like mechanical hearts remembering their purpose. People came out of hiding with the stunned reverence of survivors who had seen eternity blink. No one spoke for hours. There was nothing to say. The silence itself was holy. Then, at sunset, the lights appeared. They weren't ships. They were fragments of the harvesters, drifting in orbit like shards of glass, reflecting sunlight into impossible colors. They formed patterns, rings, spirals, constellations, and for reasons we didn't understand, they began to blink. Not randomly, deliberately. Someone at Central decoded the sequence. It was a pulse, a repeating signal in binary. We remember. Lyra's message had gone farther than anyone imagined. The deep space arrays picked up transmissions from 100 different systems, species we'd only guessed at. Some fear, some are curious, and some inspired. One message from the outer colony said, "If the humans endured, perhaps we can too." Another simply read, "Tell us how." We weren't alone anymore, not because someone had found us, but because we'd reminded them what it meant to fight for existence. I wish she could have seen it. Her name became legend overnight, Lyra of the Lightwave. Children painted her constellation on rooftops, tracing her outstretched arms across the stars. To them, she wasn't an alien. She was hope, wearing another shape. And for us, the broken, the stubborn, the still breathing, she became the proof that maybe the universe hadn't made a mistake when it allowed humanity to survive. I still keep her transmitter. It flickers sometimes, whispering static that almost sounds like her voice. Once, I thought I heard words hidden in the noise. Soft, patient, waiting. The signal continues. Maybe that's wishful thinking. Or maybe she's out there, scattered in the frequencies, watching as we rebuild. Because we are rebuilding. We've begun to call it the second dawn. Not because the sky is brighter, but because we finally understand why it matters. We were never meant to rule the stars. We were meant to remind them what courage looks like. Tonight I stand where the reactor once stood, a field of glass and flowers now, and I watch the horizon pulse with faint auroras. Some say it's radiation decay. Others think it's her echo. I think it's a heartbeat. And as the wind carries the whisper of 1 billion lives rebuilding, I realize something simple, something she must have seen long before we did. It was never our strength that made us special. Not our weapons, not our minds. It was our refusal to stop loving a world that kept trying to end us. Because that's what it means to be human. To bleed and still reach for the stars. To be afraid and still step forward. To lose everything and still whisper to the dark, "We're not done yet." The universe heard us once. And when it goes silent again, I'll whisper one more time, just to be sure. We are still here. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and share it so Lyra's light and humanity's spark never fade.